Welcome to week 67, count it, week 67 of Shark Sports Radio. It's yours truly, Mark Loisel Jr., aka Shark, right here in the Ocean State. Alongside of me today is Andrew Gifford, aka Giffy, and we have another special guest joining us tonight. Thank you all for taking a dive into the tank with us. As always, you can tune in using your Apple Podcast, SoundCloud, and or Spotify app. And please check us out on Twitter at SSR34_. And as always, at the Shark Sports Radio Facebook page. So what's on tap tonight? Well, again, we have another surprise as mentioned, and we will get into the latest NBA and NFL chatter later on in the show. But first, we are joined by Russ Bengtson, who is a longtime writer and former editor at Slam Magazine and Complex, and he's the author of the book, The History of Basketball in 15 Sneakers. So tonight is another addition to our segment called Page Turners, where we bring on sports authors and have, that have released obviously books in recent months to have them come onto the pod, talk about their book, message behind writing it, and always the impact on the sports world. So Russ's book, The History of Basketball in 15 Sneakers, was released in October. Is based on the perfect marriage between the style and brands and basketball. It's probably my favorite book I've read in quite some time, and can be purchased at hatchetbookgroup.com, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and many other bookstore outlets. Russ, thank you for taking a dive into the tank with us tonight. We really appreciate connecting with us.
Oh yeah, appreciate you guys. Thanks for having me. It's always fun to talk about it.
Absolutely. And so your book, in my eyes, is a match made in heaven. I love the idea of as you shared with me through email interaction. I love the mesh of the two elements into the great literature. Can you talk about what really made you want to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, my pretty much my entire writing career, or at least like from when I hooked on with Slam, has been sort of that line between sneakers and basketball. So, doing obviously both at Slam, doing primarily sneakers at Complex, but obviously the basketball side of things too. So I go into it in the introduction a little bit where it's like I don't remember whether it was basketball that got me into sneakers or vice versa. I mean, sneakers in general, obviously I knew about since when I was a kid, but Michael Jordan, Air Jordan, that stuff was all kind of inseparable to me. So anytime I watched a game, anytime I flipped through Sports Illustrated, like I'm watching the shoes too. So, this became something obviously that I worked on once I proposed it and once the publisher signed on to it. But at the same time, it's something that I was kind of working on like my entire life.
Right.
So, I've always been curious, and this is kind of this is the first time I've been able to have a conversation with an author. Like everybody has a different way of going about it, right? So, like some people might want to write it sequentially, kind of all the way through. Like, what was your method of writing it, and was it a sense of kind of writing a bunch of stuff and then kind of piecing it together, or did you have kind of an idea previous to writing the book, or at least previous to your first draft, as far as like how you wanted it to flow? So just kind of curious as far as kind of what your process was for the entire book.
Yeah, I mean, I knew how I wanted it to flow in the sense that once I had the sneakers locked down, it was like, okay, this is definitely going to go in chronological order. And I mean, I even knew like before when I pitched it, like obviously the Chuck Taylor was going to be where I started. Um, but kind of once it got going, and I gotta admit you, like, I wasn't sure how I was going to do it either. And there was definitely a period like from when the proposal sold to when I actually really got going where I was like, oh man, I'm like frozen up. It's like, do I report it and then write it? Do I have to like get it going in order to report it? Like, how do I even decide what the 15 are? Um,
Right.
but once that all started going, it kind of, not that it wrote itself, obviously, but, it was kind of like you're chasing all these different people to talk to about something, right? Like, I mean, I even look, you can look at like the top 10 chapter where I talked to like Kevin Greavy and Mitch Kupchak.
Yep.
And it's
Yep.
like, I had to wait until I had enough people locked down to begin even writing whatever chapter it was. So, fortunately, it's not like something, it's not fiction where it's like, you have to start at the beginning and end at the end. Like I
Sure.
was able to work separately on each chapter as like, oh man, like I just got this person. This is the important thing. Um, like Air Jordan 1, like I really needed to have talked to Sonny Vaccaro and David Falk before I could really put that together. So, um,
Absolutely.
that played into it too. So yeah, I mean, I did like, I guess kind of the roundabout way, like I did end up jumping around sometimes where it's like,
Sure.
and that's good too, because it's like, all right, you feel jammed up on something, you could just say, you know what, I'm going to set this to one side. I'm going to, work on this other thing. It's kind of funny. Like I have my tabs are a mess right now, but my tabs were maxed out forever. Like, because every chapter was a tab. So it's like you have those 15. And then like, I mean, my bookmarks folder is still insane, like just from like things I was referencing. And I would leave certain tabs open forever. I still have tabs open. The book like was turned in forever ago, published 4 months ago, and like there are still things I have tabs open for because I'm like, oh man, I don't want to close that yet.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
No,
sure.
and talk about the beginning of the book. I mean, it hits home for me. I went to Springfield College in Massachusetts, obviously, the birthplace of basketball.
Yeah.
And when you think of an inventor like James Naismith, I mean, what comes to your mind, Russ?
I mean, look, it's crazy. Like it's amazing that like you had one guy who basically set all this in motion for all of us to where like, we're all able to talk about it and watch it and everything else. And it's like, um, just the idea of someone coming up with a game that, I mean, whatever, like you could probably trace the history way back to the Aztecs throwing a human head through a hole in the wall, like something like it existed for a long time. But it's cool that like in that tiny corner of Massachusetts, you had James Naismith at the YMCA and Marquise Converse starting up Converse, and like all that sort of blossomed from there.
Yeah. It's a remarkable story. I love it.
Russ, in the Adidas chapter, you had mentioned that some of the teams were still on the Chuck Taylor train, but then kind of made the transition to Adidas, noting all the black low tops in their 1969. Are you surprised that there weren't more teams as a whole switching brands in the 60s or 70s, or do you feel like back then when it came to be just because the game was still not necessarily in its infancy because it was so new that any new sort of design or anything else was almost like a foreign concept, so they kind of went with what they knew versus switching off to any sort of like new design or brand or what have you?
Yeah, I think they were just so locked into that Chuck Taylor and to that like basic canvas vulcanized basketball shoe, whatever it was. Like I think the idea of something that, and it's kind of funny to call it that, but like the Adidas stuff to be that radical a switch, you had to really be sold into it. And the fact that obviously it was like, at least for kids, like it would have been prohibitively expensive. It's like
Sure.
Converse was expensive enough. You talk to people who like their mom wouldn't buy them the real Chuck Taylors because like you could get whatever the knockoff was even cheaper. And if
At
Adidas was
Payless.
double
Yeah.
what that was,
Yeah.
you're like dealing with like a whole separate thing. It's like people buying expensive basketball shoes now. But I think it was one of those things like, right, like the tipping point is like UCLA switching, the Celtics switching. It's like you have these like key teams that are the championship teams of their era. It's the teams that people follow. Like they switch and you're like, oh man, okay, I need to look into this. I need to figure this out. And then that being the time in the 70s when you have stuff like the Athlete's Foot and Foot Locker and stuff like that start to crop up. So it's like it becomes easier to find too. So I think it snowballed from there. Earlier on, I think it was just easier, like, all right, new pair of Chucks.
Yep. Did you have anybody, because obviously, with the amount of interviews and the amount of, like you mentioned beforehand, like being able to, kind of depended upon when you were going to be meeting with somebody to where you could work on a specific piece. But like through all the interviews that you did throughout the entire book, was there one person that you interviewed that either it was like you didn't think that you'd be able to interview, but you were able to, or somebody that you hadn't talked to before where, it was maybe awkward at first and then you kind of got in the rhythm of things? Like, what was kind of your most memorable interview, for better or for worse, throughout like all of your interviews that you did for the book?
I mean, I'll give you a couple, and unfortunately, a few of the people I've spoken to have since passed away. I mean, Kobe obviously being the biggest one. Kobe's someone I got to know pretty well over the years, like from my time at Slam. Like I covered the 96 McDonald's game. So like I first met him when he was in high school. And then like once he was with the Lakers, I would see him not all the time because we were based in New York. So like they would only come in New York and Jersey once each a year. But obviously Kobe being Kobe and the Lakers being the Lakers, there was the finals, there was the All-Star game, and like all the time. Um, and he's a guy who, getting to know him through that and through like Nike launches and whatever else, like he was very, very, very meticulous about all of it. So, I kind of knew he would be this huge get for this. And fortunately, like knowing him, and I actually knew the person at, his sort of firm that was setting up doing his press. So I figured I had a shot. But it was one of those things. I spoke to him in late December of 2019, and the helicopter crash was in January of 2020.
Yeah. That's wild.
I had gone on vacation. I was in Western Australia in 2020, and I was still on like East Coast time. My brain was a mess as far as like time zones. And we were near the Indian Ocean. So I literally woke up because I wanted to go see the ocean and swim at sunrise. And I pick up my phone. And I look down and there's a New York Times notification about the helicopter crash. And I had to read it like 5 times. I'm like, no, this is impossible. Like, there's no way. Like, I just talked to him. And then the other one on kind of the opposite end of that, and he was one of the earlier guys I spoke to for the book, was Tommy Heinsohn, who obviously Springfield, like, Boston legend, like, and I forget how long I talked to him for. It was probably like an hour. Tommy on the phone is like Tommy was on TV. It's like he's very, very, very brash. He's not really holding anything back. But it's like, even in the midst of talking to him, you're just like, or I was like, damn, like he's a connection, like basically to literally the beginning of the NBA. It's like you have stuff now. You have Jaylen Brown signing this $300 whatever million contract, and it's like, meanwhile, Tommy Heinsohn, when he first came in the league, like they're going a few guys in a car to a game through a snowstorm, like it's just such a whole different world. And to be able to just pick up the phone and talk to someone who lived that, was so crazy. And that was like Jeff Twiss, who I believe still does stuff for the Celtics. He was like their main PR guy when I was covering them in Slam, and like he was incredibly helpful.
Oh yeah, he's still there. Yep.
And I'll give you one more, like, so I wanted to talk to David Falk, because not only was he like a key Air Jordan guy, but he was for James Worthy when James signed with the New Balance, and like just doing stuff, obviously Fame, his agency, ProServe, the one he worked for before. And like, I had to connect for him, and I emailed like his assistant and like explained the whole thing and sent whatever. And late one night, my phone rings, and I look at it, and like, it wasn't a scam likely, it wasn't a block number, like it was some weird notification I've never seen before in my life, and no number. And I'm just like, all right, I don't know who this is.
I'll take it.
Yeah, so I pick it up, and it's David Falk. I'm like, oh shit, all right, I gotta like plug in the earpiece to get the recorder, whatever. And like, he basically just talked at me for like 2 hours. Like, and breaking it with like, do you really want to do this? Are you really qualified to do it? And it's just like asking me questions like, okay, do you know that and I'm like questioning myself, like, do I know how to answer this? And like,
I didn't know this was going to turn into a test.
And it kind of was. And like, it was one of those things where you hang up the phone and you need to like take a half hour just to like regather your brain, because man, like that was something. So yeah, I had the full like David Falk experience, which was that was something. That was something.
That's a trip.